So, welcome everyone. This is the sixth episode for Bridging Borders. And together with Nitin and myself,
Right.
we're very excited to be inviting the inspiring leader, Paul Chapman, founder and CEO for Moneytree, based in Japan. Welcome, Paul, for joining, and really excited to inviting you. And let me give a brief introduction. And so Paul, since its founding, Moneytree has achieved a remarkable success with their financial data platform, Moneytree Link, which has been adopted by over 120 companies, including Japan's largest banks, including MFG, SMBC, Japan Post Bank. And Moneytree's personal finance management app has been named Best of the App Store twice. And the money tree safely stores over 6 billion transaction records, connects with over 2,500 financial institutions and services. Moneytree manages over 22 million connected accounts and serves more than 6 million users. So Paul's journey before Moneytree includes founding the SaaS startup, CV Mail, which was later acquired by Thomson Reuters, and serving as IT director at N World Japan. His ambition for Japan is to accelerate innovation in banking financial services, creating a fairer, more accessible, and understandable experience for Japanese people and business. So welcome, Paul. Thanks for the time today.
Thanks, Satya. Thanks, Nitin. It's good to be here.
Such a
So,
privilege to have you, Paul, today.
Hopefully, I can live up to your expectations. Let's see where we go with the discussion.
So let me start first. So I'm very also inspired to understand about, how you establish a business in Japan at Moneytree for over 10 years. Can you tell us about a significant challenge that you had faced in a professional life and how you had kind of overcome that?
Well, the most significant challenge was establishing Moneytree, making it successful and keeping it alive. That's no easy thing, and it's not something I did all by myself, thank goodness. We really didn't know what we were getting into when we started, despite having studied and worked in Japan and having people on our board and on our side that had been here for at least 20 years at the time. It was undiscovered territory for us. We'd never really had that experience. And I'd have to say that timing was interesting because although venture capital and startups are all the rage in Japan now, when we started thinking about Moneytree, that was not the case. And then when we started doing it, like, yeah, we can do this, and we have the skills, and we speak Japanese, we had no idea about the actual level of difficulty of the task that lay in front of us. So if I was to say that what's a significant challenge aside from Moneytree, this is actually my second startup and much more successful. This first startup, which you mentioned in the intro, that was called CV Mail. It was in Australia and the UK. It was graduate recruitment was what it was called when we started. The word SaaS had not been created yet. In one of our first sales meetings, I remember telling someone, it's like Hotmail, but instead you get job applications from candidates. So I was really a law student when we started talking about that. That was probably one of the biggest things I overcame because it was a very traumatic ending to my involvement in that company. And I can look back and say, we all hopefully learned something because we were really immature, really inexperienced. That's talking about my co-founders and I. They weren't well behaved. I was not well behaved in different ways, but we were really young. And so I look back and think, well, thank God we had that experience. I did have help there, but I've had a lot more help at Moneytree. And I think that's one of the goals for your podcast, I believe, is to find little nuggets of wisdom that people can take away with them. You need a lot more advisors and supporters in Japan to really succeed at anything. And that was a revelation for me. I like to think that everyone's professional journey helps them evolve into a new person, a more self-aware version of themselves, a better version of themselves. That may not always be the case. But when I look back at myself in those days, I had my co-founders, and I didn't really want to get out of the office too much. I wanted to make something great, but not have to socialize too much to do it. And guess what? It doesn't work. You need a lot of supporters.
Totally agree with the importance of working together with the members and growing the business. I think that's a great lesson, and in every career, I think it's so great to understand and meet people. Yeah, thank you for that.
That's very interesting, Paul, what you were saying. I want to unpack what you answered a little bit and get your understanding about it. Like you said, now we are talking about startups and VCs. It's a buzz in last 2, 3 years, I would say. But 10 years back, there were startups, but nobody was talking about it. And a foreigner starting that kind of, it's like a big dream. What was your mental state at that time, which took you to this, jump of getting into the startup ecosystem world and starting something from the scratch?
Well, Nitin, there were VCs then, but it was very much an old boys ecosystem. Oh, a friend of mine, Jordan Fisher, talks about the OB ecosystem. And you've got to be an OB or an OG. That means old girl in Japanese. It doesn't translate back well into English. But you have to be part of the ecosystem behind that, which is either banking and finance, consulting, top universities. You went to the same elementary school. Your brother works with them. The thing that people imagine Asia is like, it was still like that. I think a lot of those things have changed. And what we're seeing now is that the once impossible to find door into that world now has a big sign above it saying, enter here. But there are still VCs who operate under the OB model. Even some of them are changing. Yeah, there's one very famous one that has an event every year. I used to be very annoyed that, not that they didn't invite me, but the only foreign entrepreneurs they invited was someone who wasn't really a tech entrepreneur. And it was one in like 10 years. They've really changed their tune now. So now I have this conversation with myself. If they invited me, would I go? Or would I still be angry from 10 years ago? Haven't decided yet, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that's changed too. So that's interesting. And that's a change I don't think they can walk back. They're not going to say, we had foreigners, that's it, we're done. So what were we thinking in those days? We were only thinking about the market opportunity, about the problems of the customers. We were customers of banks in Japan too, and they're now our investors, board observers, customers. We do a lot of things together, and we work toward a very similar goal, which is why they work with us. But in those days, man, the user experience was really terrible because it was very much focused on what's good for the big company, not what's good for the little guy, whether it's us, because we're not as big as a major bank. If you have that balance sheet personally, congratulations. On the other hand, small businesses also were getting the short end of the stick, as they say. But the banks have woken up to the fact that they need to change. And that's why we exist as a company, because we didn't mean to come along and build a platform that they can build on, but it turned out that was what they wanted from us. And it was the one thing that we thought they would never do. We had this app. We said, well, maybe we can put you in our app. Look how popular it is. Maybe we could connect your internet banking system and they'll use this instead, because you'll never build something as good as this. And we were kind of right. Most of them would never build something as good as that. But we've helped some of them build either something almost as good, in some cases better as a banking app. But things changed. And the lesson from that, why did we get into it? Because we didn't know any better. Why did we survive? Because we were scrappy. It was because they needed us and we convinced them they needed us. And the only partner in Japan that's a good partner is one that needs you, right? And I try telling my wife that, she doesn't accept it. We need each other. But, we had some very early partnerships, and these weren't bad companies or bad people, quite the opposite. But they just wanted to announce something. And if it didn't work, so what? So I have this rule at Moneytree. It's only been broken once, but we don't do POCs. A lot of startups say, oh, we're doing a POC. It's like, you'll POC yourself to death. It can be a POC if they pay you. It's a POC. If you tick the boxes that you agree on, it becomes a real contract. But if it's just dipping the toe in the pool, the proverbial swimming pool for that client, well, they're going to pull it back out again, right? They're not going to jump in necessarily. And then you're back to square one. So I think a lot of fintech companies, a lot of startups around the region, more so than in the US, from what I can see, Singapore, Australia, they were lulled into thinking POCs were the way to go. And in terms of how you map this to people who aren't startups, who are running established businesses or want to establish an overseas business in Japan, that same rule applies. Real partners are ones who need you. And that mutual reliance on each other keeps you both kind of honest. Japan is a very straightforward place to do business in many ways, but a lot of foreigners who come here, they would do things, bad things would happen, and they wouldn't be able to explain why the bad thing happens. And what that usually means in any context, whether it's coming to Japan or just operating in a new market, is you don't understand the model, the mental model of the people you're dealing with, because it's very logical and it's incentive driven, but people coming here unaware of them. I certainly wasn't. And we nearly died a few times as a result, not personally, but the company. We are not in that situation today, thankfully.
That's amazing, actually, how you guys have gone through those 10 years and, started something so big and so well known in the market. I have a related question to that. You made a comment that you thought that, I can work in my office and, I don't want to interact and, what we call it in Japanese, kiai. So I can see that your approach has changed. So I want to understand more how your leadership approach has changed in these last 10 years.
I can summarize it like this, and I suppose this would apply to kind of any business that's setting up here. There are epochs, right? There are different phases you go through. So the first 3 years of Moneytree, I was chief product officer. So I was the person who was putting my hand on the product saying, more like this. And then my team were like, we don't believe you. And I'd argue, and something good would come from that, balancing out the two perspectives. But that was mostly what we were about. We made this product that was at least 4, if not 5 years ahead of the US. That was our personal finance app. We won the Best of App Store the first year, as you mentioned, Satya. And, Apple welcomed us to the WWDC keynote in the VIP section, right? I still lined up that year because people line up from 2 a.m. and it's just fun. So that was in 2014. And I met the head of worldwide developer relations. And they're like, when are you coming to the US? And I'm very green. I'm like, God, who's this guy? For us, it was challenging to do that, to then establish some credibility, because we had zero credibility. I hadn't worked for Sony or Panasonic or Nomura Securities. I'd sold my previous company to a multinational that everyone recognized, but none of that was here. So we had to create something that validated us as people and as a team. And it validated it so well that this thing happened. I'm going to go through the 3 epochs. The first one is chief product officer. The second one was chief money raising officer. And I wasn't experienced at that. I didn't have the cred. I didn't have the contacts. My chairman, Jonathan, gave us the entree into that world. And in the end, our Series A, that was the first round where we sort of saved ourselves from nearly dying. That had Salesforce, Mitsubishi UFJ Capital, SMBC Venture Capital, and Mizuho Capital. Imagine asking a lot of girls, boys on a date to the prom, and your fourth choice says no, third choice says no, second choice says no, but first choice says yes. It was like that. We got a lot of no's, but the best possible investors for that round all said yes. Just took time. So in between that, we're validating ourselves and saying, look at our app, and isn't this great? And we didn't know we were going to be a platform because we didn't think the market wanted that. And we'd go to banks and card companies, and they were all building their apps via spreadsheet, because that's how you build systems in a financial institution. You have a spreadsheet with all the things you need and the checkboxes, and what they got looked like it was built in a spreadsheet. It was actually built using the tools everyone uses, but you could tell it wasn't very good. It was a new world for them. The tribal knowledge about how apps should be and how to make them had not disseminated through the market. So we found an asymmetry. Something new had happened. There wasn't enough knowledge in the market about how to leverage it. And also, we were going to a segment that's typically late to adopt technology. Once we had validation, we had to raise money. And people didn't really believe an app should be something they should invest in. This was pre-Revolut. So we couldn't raise money as an app. And so we actually ended up saying, we'll be Expensify for Japan. And we'll also do this other thing that happened to appear. Some accounting software companies that we'd met came to us and said, actually, could we use your data aggregation? And we said no to some of them maybe 2 or 3 times. And I remember a management meeting with my co-founders, especially my CTO at the time, and we're very good friends. And I said, I know we want to make an app, but money is good too. We're building the product. We're wowing people, but not quite enough. And then we nearly died. And then the market kind of knocked on our door and said, we want this part of what you're building. And that became Moneytree Link. In fact, we didn't even think very hard about the name at the start. So we raised money. The mega banks put their money in. Salesforce closed out the round. It was quite big in those days for a Series A round. Not now, but what was it, like Yon Oku, which is 400 million yen. We felt like we were doing okay. And we just had a lot of growth through the App Store. So once we'd done that, then I had to help build the team, find a real CFO. And it was really hard to get someone to want to join us. We needed someone Japanese because all of our institutionals were Japanese. Even Salesforce had a Japanese head of ventures for Japan. And then in the final stage now, last 4 years,
Yeah.
it's all been about my own leadership development, my team's development, actually only focusing on the people. Almost 98%, it's about the people for me now, which is very interesting. And I look back and I'm thinking, I could never have done that 10 years ago. I think I'm still keeping up with what Moneytree needs. If that changes, we'll go hire someone else.
Wow, I guess the three phases that you shared, starting from the production, the marketing, also the people. And I think the journey that you have done is really amazing. And also, I know that you were also previously, before Moneytree, doing CV mail, which is different. It's recruitment, and also successfully sold their business and shifted into the mobile apps and then to the money tree. So it's which is really remarkable. The question I have is all these different sectors and approaches, how have you learned and who have been your kind of biggest mentors?
The best way to answer this is to start by saying, I don't know that many people who would be my mentor to begin with, but I have two really good ones. So I guess this is dumb luck in a sense, or just relationships. Just like when we wanted to do our Series A, no one would invest. When they did invest, it was the best possible investors that we needed. Getting 3 mega banks to invest in the same round at the same time. We were the first company in history for that to happen. It took about 18 months. The second company is my friend's company, Shibayama-san at Wealth Navi. It took him, I think, 6 months, maybe 3. So much
Oh,
easier the second time. But for my mentors and people who've given me guidance, I would say definitely my chairman, Jonathan Epstein. And if not for him, we wouldn't have started the company, because he saw the opportunity in finance and we saw the opportunity to bring our ability with mobile apps and so on. So he's been in Japan for about 30 years. I met him when I was on exchange here a long time ago. And he actually inspired me to become very fluent in Japanese. I kind of overdid it with the Japanese study, but he still has things to teach me, that's for sure. The other person is someone who just appeared, someone we had met recently at the time. He spent a 40-year career at Mitsui Sumitomo, so Sumitomo Bank. He was the general manager for the finance and lease division when he retired. And around the time he retired, we started the company, it turns out. So he got introduced to us. He saw something not just attractive, but believable in us. We work really, really hard to make sure that we keep our promises. We bow very low and apologize sincerely when we mess up. We really try to understand things. I think in a sense, we've optimized our approach of being pushy, being aggressive, and not being pushy and aggressive, and not being aggressive, to meet our constituents, which are banks. It started with the app itself. So we thought that if we lost passwords to people's bank accounts or data, we could probably end up in jail. Like, we had no idea. Like, we're foreigners, what could happen? We get kicked out, our visas are canceled. I mean, just worst case scenario. And that sounds a bit fanciful, but in our heart of hearts, we're like, maybe that would happen. Like, we don't know how the Japanese justice system will treat us. And there are some examples where it's, it's not what you'd expect. So we were very cautious. I think we attuned our approach to the constituents, to the market, to the context of financial data and financial data security and so on. And yeah, we've just worked really hard to keep as many of those relationships good. I probably learned this when I was an exchange student in Japan. I won't go into too many of the details because it's incredibly embarrassing. When I was 18, I was staying with a host family in regional Japan. It was my first time in Japan, and it was the 90s. It was very different to Melbourne, Australia, where I'm from. There was a rice paddy behind my house, and we were not outside of the town. Things weren't going so well on a communication level with my host family. And eventually, I realized that was my fault. But I actually didn't really accept it was my fault because I was still very young. But I thought, oh, they were so kind to me. So on that level, I found a way to apologize to them. And man, I apologized. We're still in contact 30 years later. I didn't feel good about apologizing at some level. I'm like, no, I'm right. When I look back, I'm like, you idiot, just say sorry. But I was young. I didn't know. I see this with some people in my team. There are times when you think you're right, when you have to sacrifice because the relationship's more important, right? And it works in the other direction too. So once a big client said, oh, you've stolen our IP, and we actually got to prove to them it was our IP, And in the end, we still compromised to their benefit mostly.
Mm.
But yeah, we stopped them just sort of steamrolling us. You're not just beholden to the people you serve, they're actually beholden to you too. And that's the nature of a relationship. It's bidirectional.
So I think your sincerity, I guess, coming from your experiences that really created the building, the trustworthiness. And it's really amazing to hear the three banks you have also got the finance. It's really how you had actually built the connections and really kind of understand the needs and also in the longer term.
Mm.
So I think it's something that I really learned, and thank you for sharing that.
I think it's great what you were saying, Paul, that how you have imbibed the culture, because sometimes what happens, people come here and they start despising the culture where they're coming in, but you have gone on the opposite direction. You said, okay, let me be fluent in the language, what you are saying, and try to understand how the people of the land think about, like, how can I do the business? And you exploited that opportunity there, which was available, which is great.
That's I think a good summary of what I said. It sounds like a straight path. I went from A to B to C, success. I mean, it's more like this, right? You're going all over the place, going backwards. Moving to any country, you're going to find things you don't like. After my first year in Japan, it was like a riddle for me. I really like some things about Japan, and other things I really don't like. And I think the way I pursued that was trying to find out if I could make I guess, a comfortable or enjoyable life for myself in Japan. Over time, I think just having something to work on, even though it's incredibly hard and tiring, notwithstanding that, my attitude towards Japan hasn't gotten worse, it's gotten better. Perhaps it's because I've become more attuned to how these things are, a bit more self-aware, a bit more at peace with myself. But everyone goes through some degree of the honeymoon is over syndrome. I think that's absolutely normal, and there's nothing wrong with that, and people shouldn't freak out. But to get past it, yeah, you need to find not just mentors, but your besties, the people that you can rely on, the people that you're closest to. You need to have your anchors here as well. That could be a spouse, it could be a small circle of friends, it could be a professional group. I see a lot of foreigners who here long term are very active in professional groups. Could be a podcast. I think you've just got to find your anchors and learn to be at peace with the things that are a certain way. The longer I'm here, the more I understand the way things are. And this is dangerous if you're an innovator because you start accepting things. And when you accept things too much, you don't want to change them. So I always try to check myself, but we'll see how we go.
I think you summarized it pretty well in a sense that, how you have evolved. I can imagine it now, from 90s to now we are in the, 2000 coming in 30s, that
Oh
how
gosh.
the journey has moved and you had your own ups and downs. You have also touched about, some good lessons for the listeners. So I'll actually tweak our last question, which is advice to the leaders who are listening. I think maybe if you can talk about leaders who are thinking of starting something on their own, like what are the, advice you will give them both to the Japanese and the foreigners who are thinking of disrupting what you said, that innovation and stuff.
One of the most challenging things, and I'll be very purposeful in the way I describe this, I'm a very big fan of diversity. And also diversity is very difficult to manage. Half of my staff are non-Japanese at least, and then the other half are, and then maybe 1/3 are bilingual, bicultural. But that's a lot of different perspectives on the way things should be. And we have very domestic clients. This is Japan. You have to understand their mental models, their values, their incentives to work with them. But diversity is difficult because you need to get everyone on the same page, understanding the market with the same context. And that's hard in Japan. If you go to the United States, you go to Western Europe, I'd say much easier in some ways because there's a lot more similarity with other countries, and you can probably see it on TV. Most people come here with not much of an understanding, and getting everyone to face in the same direction and work toward the same goal is really challenging. On the other hand, once upon a time, Japan had really no diversity beyond Japanese people, and it was a very, very successful model, incredibly successful, perhaps the most successful in history, certainly in the 20th century. But then it stopped working. And why? Because Japan optimized for making things work, for integration between the people doing the work, but not for entrepreneurship, not for coming up with new things or challenging the way things are, because harmony means you're not challenging things. And as I said, my concern is that I'm going to become too cushy and harmonious with all my clients and forget that you should do this better. I think at least self-awareness is the first step towards not falling into that trap entirely. So if you pursue building a business here, make a choice. Is it a business that's trying to leverage diversity and therefore new thinking and challenging thinking and having a team that isn't too subservient? A subservient team is not going to come up with very many ideas. If you're the genius running it, that's great. On the other hand, if you're building something faster, cheaper, easier, without challenging people's mental models too much, then you could probably have not a very diverse team. I'd say that deciding on what you want to do and then deciding the right team for that is a very important thing. But I'm a fan of diversity. I just didn't think it would be as difficult as it is. But I'm glad that we've set off on this journey because there's a lot of learning.
I think it's a great advice. I really the idea of self-awareness about where you are heading to, and then the structure to it. Like you explained it in a very concise way, but in a very beautiful way, that, you know, when you need diversity and when you don't need diversity. I really like that. I think it's not going to be helpful only for our audience. I was enlightened to hear that. So thanks a lot, Paul.
Definitely the diversity. Hearing from the story, that will definitely create the understanding of others, and which also benefits understanding the customers. And I think that's a great point that you made, and thank you for that.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for your time. Really appreciate that. I think there's a lot of knowledge nuggets there for our audience. I think everybody will appreciate that. So thanks a lot for your time today.